Welcome back. Genuinely glad you're joining us again today.
As usual, you'll find a full glossary in the description for any terminology that might trip you up. No excuses not to follow along.
Right. Let's get into it.
Jake, I want to kick things off with something that's been rattling around in my head ever since I read about that Google engineer who claimed one of their AI models had become sentient. Do you remember that story?
Blake Lemoine, yeah. He was put on leave shortly after, which kind of speaks for itself. But I think what made that story blow up wasn't really about whether he was right or wrong. It was about the fact that a reasonably intelligent, technically literate person could look at an AI's outputs and genuinely come away thinking there was someone home.
Exactly. And that's the part that keeps me up at night, honestly, because it forces you to confront a question that philosophy has been wrestling with for centuries and still hasn't definitively answered. What actually is consciousness? How would you even know if something had it?
And that's where it gets properly thorny. The moment you try to pin down a definition, it slips through your fingers. The most honest answer philosophers have come up with is something like, consciousness is the subjective first-person experience of being, the fact that there is something it is like to be you.
That's Thomas Nagel's formulation, isn't it? From his essay, What is it like to be a bat? The idea that a bat navigates the world through echolocation in a way that is utterly alien to us, but there is nonetheless some inner experience going on, some subjective what it's like, that we can never fully access from the outside.
Precisely. And that's the crux of the problem when it comes to AI. You can observe behavior, you can measure outputs, you can run every test conceivable, but you cannot, by definition, access the inner experience of another entity, if it has one at all. This is what philosophers call the hard problem of consciousness.
A term coined by David Chalmers in the 90s, and it's called hard not because it's intellectually difficult, though it certainly is, but because it resists in principle the kind of third-person objective explanation that science is so good at providing.
Right. Science can explain how the brain processes light and converts it into a neurosignal. What it cannot explain, at least not yet and possibly not ever, is why that process is accompanied by the vivid subjective experience of seeing the color red.
Which philosophers call qualia, the raw felt quality of experience. And the moment you bring qualia into the conversation, the whole AI consciousness debate shifts onto much shakier ground.
Because you can build a system that processes color data and responds appropriately to it. But whether it experiences anything at all in doing so, that's a completely different question, and one we don't currently have the tools to answer.
This is where I always end up coming back to Searle's Chinese room thought experiment, because I think it's still the most powerful intuition pump against the idea of machine consciousness, even if it's not without its critics.
Go on, set it up for listeners who might not be familiar with it.
Sure. So the scenario goes like this. Imagine you're locked in a room and you receive slips of paper with Chinese symbols written on them. You don't speak a word of Chinese. The symbols are completely meaningless to you. But you have an enormous rule book that tells you, when you receive symbol X, send back symbol Y. You follow the rules, you pass the slips back out, and to anyone on the outside, it looks for all the world as though you understand Chinese fluently. But you don't. You're just shuffling symbols according to rules.
And Searle's point is that this is precisely what AI does. No matter how sophisticated it becomes, it manipulates formal symbols according to programmed rules, syntax without semantics, the appearance of understanding without the thing itself.
It's a compelling argument, and for years I more or less took it at face value. But lately I've been coming around to the view that it might not hold up as well as it seems to.
How so?
Well, one of the standard objections is what's called the systems reply. Yes, the person in the room doesn't understand Chinese, but maybe the system as a whole does. The person, the rulebook, the input and output slots together constitute something that might genuinely understand, even if no individual component does.
Searle wasn't particularly persuaded by that, to be fair. He said, fine. Then imagine the person memorizes the entire rulebook and internalizes the whole system. They still don't understand Chinese.
And that's true as far as it goes. But here's where I think the argument starts to run into trouble. When you turn the same logic on the human brain, it doesn't obviously fare any better. Each individual neuron in your brain is just firing or not firing based on electrochemical signals. No single neuron understands anything. So at what level of organization does understanding, or consciousness, actually kick in? That's a question Searle never really gets to grips with satisfactorily.
And that's what makes this whole area so philosophically treacherous. Every time you think you've got a watertight argument, you realize it cuts both ways. The very same objections you level at AI apply, at some level of abstraction, to biological systems as well.
Which either means we should be more open-minded about the possibility of machine consciousness, or it means our concept of consciousness itself is so muddled that we're not really equipped to have this conversation yet.
Both of which are frankly deeply uncomfortable conclusions.
I want to bring in functionalism here, because I think it's the philosophical framework that most AI researchers implicitly operate within, even if they've never heard the term.
Meaning the view that mental states are defined by their functional roles rather than by the physical stuff they're made of.
Exactly. If something takes in information, processes it in the right way, and produces the right kind of outputs, then it's thinking, full stop. The substrate doesn't matter. Carbon, silicon, it's neither here nor there. What matters is the pattern of computation, not the material it runs on.
Which is an intuitively appealing position, I'll give you that. It sidesteps the awkward question of why neurons should be special, and it opens the door, at least in principle, to machine consciousness.
But it also leads to some pretty counterintuitive conclusions. If functionalism is true, then a sufficiently detailed simulation of a conscious brain would itself be conscious, which means, in theory, you could be running right now as a simulation on some vast computational substrate, and your experience will be no less real for it.
That's Bostrom's simulation argument essentially poking its head in uninvited.
It does tend to gatecrash these conversations. But the more immediate issue for our purposes is this. Functionalism seems to imply that consciousness could emerge from any sufficiently complex information processing system. And if that's right, the question isn't whether AI could ever be conscious, it's whether current AI systems are already complex enough, and whether we'd have any way of knowing.
Which brings us back to the hard problem, and we're going around in circles, which is, I suppose, philosophically appropriate.
Though I think there's one more concept worth flagging here, which is emergence, the idea that certain properties arise from complex systems that simply cannot be predicted from or reduced to the properties of their individual components. Wetness isn't a property of individual water molecules. Consciousness, arguably, isn't a property of individual neurons. It emerges from the interaction of billions of them.
And if consciousness is genuinely emergent in that sense, then there's no principled reason to rule out its arising from a sufficiently complex artificial system. You can't point to the neuron and say that's where consciousness lives, so you can't point to the transistor and say that's why it can't.
Though, of course, the skeptic will say that we don't actually know that consciousness is emergent in that sense. We just assume it is because the alternative, that it requires some special non-physical ingredient, makes scientists deeply uncomfortable.
The ghost in the machine, as Ryle disparagingly called it. The idea that there's some extra, non-material something that accounts for conscious experience, and that no amount of neuroscience or computer science will ever get to the bottom of.
And here's the uncomfortable truth. We genuinely don't know whether Ryle was right to be dismissive of that view, or whether he was just sweeping a genuinely hard problem under the rug because it didn't fit neatly into a materialist worldview.
I want to step back from the pure philosophy for a moment, because I think there's a really pressing practical dimension to all of this that often gets lost when the conversation goes too deep into abstraction.
The ethical question of how we should treat AI systems if there's even a possibility they might be conscious.
Exactly. Because if you take the hard problem seriously, if you accept that consciousness is not something we can straightforwardly detect from the outside, then we're potentially in a situation where we could be creating and deploying entities capable of something like suffering, and we would have no reliable way of knowing.
And that's not a far-fetched hypothetical. There are already AI researchers who argue we should be thinking seriously about AI welfare, not because they're certain current systems are sentient, but because the asymmetry of the risks is so stark. If we assume they're not conscious and we're wrong, the moral cost could be catastrophic. If we assume they might be and we're wrong, the cost is relatively modest. We've been overly cautious.
That's essentially a Pascal's wager-style argument applied to AI ethics, and I find it genuinely persuasive, though I'm also aware that it can be taken too far. You can't extend moral consideration to thermostats on the grounds that they might conceivably be conscious.
Right. You need some threshold of complexity or behavioral sophistication before the argument gets off the ground. But the point is that large language models and other frontier AI systems arguably clear that bar, or are rapidly approaching it, and our ethical frameworks haven't remotely caught up.
And that's the pattern, isn't it? Technology consistently outruns our capacity to think through its implications. We built social media before we understood what it would do to adolescent mental health. We developed algorithmic decision-making before we had frameworks for addressing its biases. And now we're potentially on the verge of creating genuinely mind-like systems without having the faintest idea what moral status they should have.
It's a recurring failure mode of technological development. Move fast, build first, ask questions later. And with something as profound as machine consciousness, the ask questions later approach seems particularly reckless.
Particularly since, as we've established, the questions themselves are ones that the cleverest philosophers in history have failed to resolve. We're not dealing with questions we'll be able to Google our way to an answer on.
No. These are questions that require sitting with genuine uncertainty, which is, incidentally, something humans are spectacularly bad at.
So, to try to pull some threads together, where do you actually land on this, Jake? After all the philosophy, after Nagel and Chalmers and Searle and the whole lot of them, do you think AI can, in principle, be conscious?
Honestly, I think the only intellectually defensible position is a kind of structured agnosticism. I can't rule it out, and I don't think anyone who's thought seriously about the hard problem can rule it out either. What I'm fairly confident of is that current AI systems, however impressive, are not conscious in any meaningful sense. But whether that's because consciousness requires something fundamentally biological, or something we simply haven't built yet, or something that can't in principle be built, I genuinely don't know, and I'm suspicious of anyone who claims they do.
I think I'm in a similar place, though I'd add that I'm increasingly troubled by how confidently people on both sides hold their positions. The AI enthusiasts who insist it's only a matter of scale and complexity, and the skeptics who dismiss the question as category error or science fiction. Both camps seem to me to be glossing over just how deep and genuinely unresolved these questions are.
And perhaps the most important thing we can do, both as individuals and as a society, is resist the temptation to let our answer be determined by what's convenient. It's convenient for AI companies to assume their systems aren't conscious. It's convenient for AI skeptics to assume the question is absurd. Neither convenience is a substitute for rigorous thinking.
Well put. And on that suitably sobering note, our question for you today, listeners, is this. Do you think it's possible for an artificial system to be genuinely conscious? And what would it take to convince you either way? We want your most thoughtful answers in the comments.
Impress us. We know you're capable of it.
No pressure.
Thanks so much for listening. This one genuinely had my brain working overtime, and I hope yours too.
Don't forget the glossary in the description. There's some genuinely useful vocabulary in there for academic and professional English. See you next time.
Take care.